Tonight, picture the air thick with wood smoke and the warm, greasy haze that only a frontier saloon could conjure. The kind of place where the light is dim enough to make everyone look mysterious, yet bright enough that you still see the dust caked on boots, the sag of a saddle-worn shirt, and the faint glint of sweat on a gambler's brow. In one corner, a black iron stove gives off a steady heat, the belly of it glowing red where the logs inside collapse into embers. On that stove sits a skillet so scarred and seasoned it looks older than the town itself, and inside, bubbling away in bacon fat, are flapjacks. Sourdough flapjacks so dense and heavy they could double as poker chips. If anyone was bold enough to slam one down on the felt, you'd probably never make it through a single frontier night. But don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below so none of us feel alone tonight. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together, here on Timeless Sleep. The sourdough starter was the secret heart of those flapjacks. Cowboys treated it like a living pet, a bubbling, yeasty culture kept in tins tied to their saddlebags. It hissed and sighed like it had opinions about the trail, which, to be fair, it probably did. Forget gold nuggets. The true treasure might just be a starter old enough to remember the last roundup. Men guarded it carefully, feeding it flour and water as if it were a cranky child, because a dead starter meant no flapjacks, and no flapjacks meant mornings were even grimmer than usual. A cowboy without flapjacks. That's just a man gnawing sadness off a piece of jerky. Now, these flapjacks weren't like the pillow fluffy pancakes that modern diners drown in maple syrup. Oh no, these were what you'd get if you asked bread to do push-ups until it snapped. Dense, chewy, thick as a saddle blanket. They hit your stomach with the impact of a thrown horseshoe. But that was exactly the point. The frontier wasn't a place for dainty foods. A cowboy needed something that would stick with him through miles of dust, wind, and the endless clank of spurs. Imagine trying to survive a cattle drive on croissants. You'd be trampled before lunchtime. The cooking process itself was half comedy routine, half survival test. Trail cooks scooped a dollop of batter, which was more like cement paste than liquid, onto a skillet already swimming in bacon grease. The batter spread just enough to make you wonder if it was alive, then settled into a sizzling disc. The smell was smoky, salty, and so full of pork fat that your arteries could sense danger before the first bite. If you were lucky, you got one flipped just right, with the edges crisp and the centre cooked through. If you weren't, well, let's just say you chewed until your jaw begged for mercy. Saloons made flapjacks at every hour because demand never stopped. At dawn, ranch hands wolfed them down before saddling up. At midnight, gamblers stumbled away from poker tables to grab a plate and soak up their whiskey. And at that strange hour just before sunrise, travellers dropped coins on the counter for flapjacks to carry them back onto the trail. Flapjacks were democracy on a plate. Every man, whether broke drifter or silver-rich miner, could get one. The only difference was whether he could afford molasses on top. Speaking of toppings, options were, let's call them minimalist. Sometimes saloons scored a shipment of molasses by rail, thick and dark as liquid midnight. Cowboys would pour it slow, watching it ooze across the flapjack like it was racing a snail. If fruit made it into town, canned peaches or apples might crown the stack. But those moments were as rare as a polite outlaw. More often than not, the only topping was another spoonful of pork grease. Yes, you heard right. Grease as a condiment. Somewhere a French chef just fainted into his soufflé. But for men who had spent days choking down hardtack or gnawing jerky that could chip a tooth, a hot flapjack dripping in grease was pure luxury. That first bite, the mix of tangy sourdough and smoky fat, was enough to silence even the loudest saloon chatter. You could practically hear stomachs sighing in relief. And that last flapjack left on the plate? Oh, that was prize territory. The man who got it usually scored an extra drizzle of sweetness or grease, and in the Wild West that counted as winning the lottery. Flapjacks weren't just food, they were social glue. Picture the saloon in the blue haze of dawn, cowboys hunched over tin plates, shoulders brushing, boots muddy from the trail. They didn't need words. The act of chewing those heavy cakes together, sharing the skillet's bounty, was a language of survival. It told you, we're in this dust-blown mess together. A flapjack was both a meal and a handshake made of flour and grease. Trail songs were written about many things: horses, lost loves, the occasional tragic river crossing. But the humble flapjack always made its way in. Cowboys sang about flapjacks sticking to their ribs, about flapjacks bouncing in their saddlebags, about flapjacks doubling as makeshift roofing tiles in a pinch. Was it exaggeration? Of course. But if a pancake can double as construction material, that's just another badge of honour. Now let's address the texture honestly. These weren't light. Eating two could put you in what we'd politely call a frontier nap, which is when your body decides to shut down before the whiskey can finish its job. A man might lean back in his chair, hat tilted over his face, flapjack still in hand, and drift off. Honestly, in a saloon filled with the clatter of poker chips, the jangle of spurs, and someone inevitably shouting about cheating, a flapjack-induced coma was probably the safest sleep available. It's funny to think about how sourdough culture connects centuries. Those cowboys weren't inventing anything new. Prospectors in Alaska kept sourdough alive in frozen cabins. Gold Rush miners clutched starter jars as carefully as their claims. Even medieval bakers fed their bubbling pots daily, muttering at the yeast like prayer candles. The Wild West just added bacon grease and dust, and that's how history marches forward. One greasy flapjack at a time. Imagine carrying that starter tin on your saddle. The trail jostles it so much it's practically mixing itself. Sometimes the lid pops loose, and suddenly your saddlebag smells like a bread factory collided with a brewery. Cowboys joked that if they ever lost their starter, they'd sooner go without whiskey than flapjacks. And in cowboy math, that's like choosing to breathe water instead of air. The flapjack also had its role in poker drama. Picture a gambler leaning over the table, cards in one hand, flapjack in the other. He takes a bite, chews slowly, then slaps down a full house with grease still glistening on his fingers. That's intimidation. No one raises against a man who can juggle gambling and digestion at the same time. Kids in towns loved flapjacks too. Not because of the taste, though sweet molasses helped, but because of the spectacle. Watching flapjacks flip in the skillet, sizzling like they might catch fire any second, was free entertainment. In a world without Netflix, watching your breakfast nearly ignite was the next best thing. By the end of a long night, when the whiskey had blurred most men's vision, and the smoke hung low enough to chew, that skillet of flapjack still bubbled on. The cook, apron-stained beyond recognition, ladled out another portion, muttering curses that somehow flavoured the batter. Cowboys didn't notice. They only knew that with every heavy bite the night seemed less cold, the trail less long, and the loneliness of the frontier a little more bearable. So when you think of the Wild West, don't just picture revolvers, dust storms, or outlaw duels. Picture the quiet hero of the saloon stove, the sourdough flapjack. Heavy, greasy, stubbornly unglamorous, but unforgettable. The taste of grit, survival, and a strange kind of comfort only the frontier could serve. The saloon stove was never idle, and when flapjacks weren't hissing in bacon grease, there was often a pot of something darker, stranger, and far more intimidating simmering slowly, son of a gun stew. The name itself carried a certain wildness, as if even language had shrugged and said, "Well, son of a gun, what else do you call this?" It wasn't the sort of stew you bragged about at home, unless you wanted your relatives to faint into their Sunday gravy. But for cowboys on cattle drives or gamblers scraping together coins in a dusty town, this dish was survival ladled into a tin bowl. You didn't just eat son of a gun stew, you had to accept it as a dare from the cook. Every part of the steer that respectable city folks would politely bury under dirt or ignore on a butcher's floor ended up in this pot. We're talking tripe, liver, kidneys, marrow bones, tongue, heart, lungs, and yes, sometimes even brain. If a cow had once used it, there was a good chance it was floating in that broth, bobbing gently as if waving hello to the next victim. Nothing went to waste. Ranch hands called it nose-to-tail eating, modern food bloggers would call it sustainable dining, and charge you $40 a bowl. Preparation was equal parts medicine and madness. The trail cook hacked up the organ meats into uneven chunks. Not cubes, not slices, just whatever shape came from his knife after 3 cups of coffee and 0 patience. He tossed them into a cast-iron kettle big enough to baptize a horse, added onions, potatoes, and whatever herbs he'd foraged from the side of the trail, then drowned the whole thing in water. Hours of slow boiling followed, the kind of simmer that filled the air with a fragrance both inviting and terrifying. You caught hints of pepper, onion, and savoury fat, and then, just beneath, the faint metallic tang that whispered, "This used to be someone's digestive system." Yet somehow, by the time bowls were ladled out, the flavours had melted into a dark, hearty, peppery broth. It was thick enough to coat your spoon, and rich enough to make your stomach stop complaining about yesterday's jerky. Cowboys hunched over their bowls, blowing on the steam, eyes half closed like men praying for bravery. The first sip was always the hardest. You never knew what piece you'd bite into. Tender tongue, chewy tripe, or something you'd rather not identify until after you'd swallowed. There was a kind of rough humour in it all. Cowboys claimed toughness wasn't measured by how fast you could draw a revolver, but whether you could finish a full bowl of this stew without gagging. Survive a gunfight? Impressive. Swallow 3 chunks of boiled lung? Legendary. The cook would grin, ladling more into your bowl because in his mind the real entertainment wasn't the poker table. It was watching hardened men flinch at dinner. But beneath the jokes lay something deeper, respect for the animal. On cattle drives, every steer mattered. Wasting meat wasn't an option. A cow had given its life, and throwing away half of it felt like an insult to the long ride that had brought it to the pot. Cowboys might groan at the chewy bits, but they knew the stew carried both nourishment and honour. It was the frontier's way of saying, nothing is useless, not even a brain that once thought about grass. In towns like Dodge City or Abilene, son of a gun stew became a saloon staple. It was cheap, filling, and perfectly suited to men who hadn't seen a proper kitchen in months. You could stumble in at midnight, dust in your hair and saddle sores screaming, toss a coin on the bar and be rewarded with a steaming bowl. Maybe you didn't want to ask what part of the cow you were eating, but you wanted the warmth. The stew lined your stomach against whiskey, soothed the ache of trail miles, and gave you enough calories to keep moving when dawn came. Even the name had stories behind it. Some claimed son of a gun was code for serving absolutely everything, so much so that you could end up with a bullet casing or spur nail in the broth. Others swore the dish was originally cooked on ships, where women sometimes gave birth between cannons on the gun deck, hence son of a gun. The stew inherited the name because it was just as surprising, messy, and impossible to predict. Whatever the origin, the title stuck. Like grease on a saloon wall, the broth itself developed a mythology. Cowboys insisted it could cure saddle rash, heartbreak, or even snakebite if you drank it fast enough. One story told of a gambler who swore the stew helped him win a hand of poker, not because it gave him luck, but because everyone at the table was too busy gagging to notice him dealing from the bottom. Another tale spoke of a cook who secretly added chili peppers, making the stew so spicy that men sweated through their hats. The effect was dramatic enough that one cowboy claimed he saw visions of his long-lost mule in the steam. Modern diners might recoil at the idea, but organ meats were common in the 1800s. City dwellers ate liver and onions, miners fried kidneys, and families boiled marrow bones for soups. What made son of a gun stew different was its sheer determination to include everything. It was less a recipe than a declaration. This cow died for us, and by heaven, we'll eat until there's nothing left but hooves. And sometimes, if you weren't careful, you might find one of those too. Of course, not every cowboy was brave enough. There were always a few who pushed the bowl aside, muttering excuses about not being hungry. That was a mistake. The stew became a test of loyalty, a rite of passage. Refuse a drink and you were just cautious. Refuse son of a gun stew, and suddenly the saloon was full of raised eyebrows and whispers about whether you could handle the trail at all. More than one greenhorn choked down a chunk of tripe just to avoid being laughed out of town, and strangely some men grew to love it. The chewiness of heart, the richness of marrow, the strange creaminess of brain. It became comfort food. After weeks of bland beans and bread, the stew carried spice and texture, a reminder that life still held variety, even if the variety came from an animal's digestive tract. Cowboys would sit with bowls steaming in front of them, sighing in contentment, as if they'd discovered the frontier's version of fine dining. Saloons leaned into the drama. They'd post signs outside, stew always on. Inside, the kettle never emptied. The cook added water, more meat, more potatoes, more salt. It was a perpetual stew, bubbling day and night, each serving carrying whispers of yesterday's pot. In a way, you weren't just eating stew. You were tasting the history of meals past, layered and simmered into the broth. That thought either made you grateful or deeply unsettled. Imagine the scene. A poker game in one corner, laughter echoing from the bar, a fiddle scraping through a tune, and in the centre of it all that cast-iron pot, steam curling toward the rafters. Cowboys lined up, bowls in hand, clattering spoons ready. The first sip burned your tongue, the second warmed your chest, and by the third, you were convinced you could survive another week on the trail. That was the power of son-of-a-gun stew. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't delicate, but it was strength ladled from a pot, courage served in greasy broth. And so the dish became part of frontier legend. Not because of its taste, though some swore it grew on you, but because of what it represented. Grit, economy, refusal to waste. The cowboy's creed boiled down into a single bowl. Today, people remember it less for the recipe and more for the symbolism. It stands as a reminder that survival sometimes requires swallowing things you'd rather not name and finding pride in the act of finishing the bowl. So if flapjacks were the comfort of the frontier, son-of-a-gun stew was its dare. One fed the body with warmth and memory. The other tested your stomach, your grit, and your place in the saloon. And somehow, between the grease and the laughter, both became unforgettable flavours of the Wild West. The saloon stove rarely cooled, and when the stew pot wasn't bubbling with unidentifiable organs, another dish was usually simmering beside it, filling the smoky room with a smell that clung to shirts, saddles, and even poker chips, fried salt pork and beans. If you picture the Wild West without this meal, you're picturing the wrong century. Nearly every saloon west of the Mississippi kept some version of it steaming in cast iron, ready to scoop into a tin bowl whenever a cowboy staggered in, half-starved from the trail. This was the dish that held the frontier together. You could take away the whiskey, the poker, even the piano in the corner, but if you dared take away the beans, you'd have a riot on your hands faster than you could say, ante up. Salt pork was the backbone of the meal. Unlike fresh beef or chicken, which spoiled faster than a gambler's luck, salt pork could survive weeks, even months, without refrigeration. Packed in heavy barrels of brine, the slabs looked more like bricks than food. When a cook pried one out, dripping with salt water and glistening in pale streaks of fat, it didn't exactly inspire poetry. But slice it thick, toss it into a skillet, and suddenly the saloon filled with a sizzling, smoky perfume that could drag a cowboy out of a dead sleep. The fat rendered down into liquid gold, popping and spitting as the meat crisped at the edges. Beans, on the other hand, were the quiet hero. Pinto beans, navy beans, black beans if you were lucky, whatever the supply wagon could haul. They soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, before being simmered low and slow in iron kettles. The beans absorbed the salt, the fat, and whatever stray flavours the cook tossed in. Maybe an onion, maybe a splash of molasses, maybe nothing at all. Left alone long enough, the mixture thickened into something rich, smoky, and endlessly filling. Each spoonful clung to your ribs like glue, making sure you didn't faint halfway through the cattle drive. When the two finally met, crisp pork laid across steaming beans, the result was frontier alchemy. Not delicate, not refined, but deeply satisfying. The beans softened the salt's sharp bite, the pork fat enriched the beans, and together they formed a dish that was both punishment and blessing. Punishment, because the salt left your lips parched as desert sand. Blessing, because the warmth spread through your chest like someone had lit a fire in your ribs. It was food that reminded you why survival mattered in the first place. Trail cooks had a rhythm with this dish. They could fry pork and ladle beans while half asleep, eyes barely open, one hand scratching at the stubble on their chin. Some joked they could do it blindfolded, though. The resulting grease fires suggested otherwise. The beans were forgiving. Even if the cook forgot them for hours, they only grew thicker, heartier. And cowboys weren't picky. If the spoon could stand upright in the pot, the beans were done. If the spoon sank too fast, they just needed more time. That was the entire recipe. No cookbooks required. Saloons knew the demand never stopped. Beans were cheap, pork was reliable, and together they could feed a roomful of hungry men without bankrupting the establishment. A gambler could stumble in at 3 a.m, pockets empty from a lost hand, and still scrounge enough for a plate of pork and beans. A ranch hand could ride into town after weeks of dust and rain, drop a coin on the counter, and find himself with the same meal his father ate, his neighbour ate, and his trail boss ate. The dish was equalizer and comfort rolled into one. Every cowboy had his preferred version. Some swore beans weren't complete without a drizzle of molasses, dark and sweet, softening the salt's bite. Others demanded onions diced and fried until they caramelized in the pork fat. Still others liked their beans plain, arguing that flavour was a city man's luxury. And then there were the pranksters who added chili peppers, turning supper into a fire hazard that sent cowboys gasping for water, hats flapping as they fanned their burning tongues. Nothing said frontier friendship quite like setting your buddy's mouth on fire. Salt pork itself had quirks. Too thin a slice, and it shriveled into something closer to a salt lick than meat. Too thick, and the middle stayed chewy, daring your teeth to a duel. The perfect cut balance, crisp edges with a soft centre, a feat few cooks mastered but every cowboy prayed for. And yet, even the worst attempts disappeared quickly. Hunger was a critic with very low standards. If it was hot, salty, and didn't crawl off the plate, it was dinner. The dish carried more than just calories. It carried memory. Many cowboys came from farms where beans were Sunday staples and pork was butchered fresh in autumn. Eating pork and beans in a saloon stirred echoes of home kitchens, mothers ladling beans into chipped bowls, fathers slicing bacon thick with pride. In the midst of whiskey fumes and poker curses, that memory softened the edge of loneliness. You could almost imagine the saloon as a family table, if your family happened to include 10 men you barely knew and one piano player with 3 fingers. Beans had practical uses too. Cowboys joked that beans provided both fuel for the body and noise for the campfire. A circle of men eating beans meant a night full of laughter, punctuated by sounds that echoed across the prairie like ghostly bugles. It wasn't dignified, but dignity was rarely a priority west of the Mississippi. The important part was that beans kept men alive, strong, and, in their own noisy way, entertained. Some saloons even made pork and beans their signature. They served it 24 hours a day, a pot always simmering, bowls always ready. Travellers came to know which towns had the best beans, gossiping like critics about whether Dodge cities were creamier than Abilene's. Gamblers swore a good plate of beans gave them luck, though skeptics pointed out it was mostly just indigestion. Still, the dish became a constant presence, part of the very identity of frontier life. Imagine sitting in one of those saloons after a long day on the trail. Your boots are caked in mud, your shirt stiff with sweat, your back aching from the saddle. You drop into a chair, slam your coin on the table, and within minutes a steaming plate arrives. The beans are thick, the pork glistening, the smell so rich you forget your own exhaustion for a moment. You dig in, chewing slowly, and for a few blessed minutes the world shrinks to a bowl of food that doesn't judge you, doesn't challenge you, doesn't ask you to ride another mile. It just fills you, warms you, and lets you breathe. No one wrote songs about pork and beans. No cowboy composed poetry about them by the fire. But in their plain, unglamorous way, they built the West as much as revolvers or railroads. Every mile ridden, every herd driven, every saloon brawl broken up by the sheriff. Behind it all was the steady fuel of beans simmered in pork fat. They were the unspoken backbone, the unsung ballad, and when a cowboy leaned back in his chair, belly full, hat tilted low, and sighed with contentment, you could be sure of one thing. Somewhere nearby, another pot was already bubbling, ready to do it all over again. So while son of a gun stew tested grit and flapjacks tested patience, fried salt pork and beans tested something quieter, endurance. They weren't daring, they weren't flashy, but they kept men alive through endless days of dust and nights of whiskey. And for that, in the smoky glow of every frontier saloon, they were unforgettable. If flapjacks were comfort and beans were endurance, then prairie oysters were the daredevil stunt act of the Wild West menu. Known today with the slightly more marketable name of Rocky Mountain oysters, these were not, despite desperate wishful thinking, actual oysters. They were bull testicles. Yes, you heard that right. Saloon cooks, trail hands, and ranchers somehow decided that after branding cattle and surviving dust storms, the most logical next step was to slice up the animal's most delicate parts, fry them golden, and serve them with hot sauce. The West was nothing if not creative, or perhaps just very committed to never wasting anything, no matter how much it made outsiders squirm. The origins of the dish were practical. During cattle roundups, castration was part of the process. The animals weren't just being managed for breeding, but also to make them less aggressive and easier to handle. That left buckets of freshly removed organs lying around, and on the frontier nothing went to waste. Some brave or possibly reckless soul figured out that if you cleaned them, sliced them thin, dredged them in flour and spices, and dropped them into sizzling fat, they transformed from absolutely not to pass the mustard. Cowboys swore the taste was surprisingly mild, not so different from fried chicken or tender veal. The first bite might have been a shock to the mind, but the second usually went down easier, especially when paired with whiskey. The preparation itself became a ritual. A ranch cook would stand over a pan of boiling tallow, dropping in slices one by one. The sound was a crackle, a sizzle, and a little hiss as the meat hit the hot oil. The smell was savoury, meaty, and oddly inviting, like fried cutlets. On branding days, platters of prairie oysters were set out beside mugs of beer. Men gathered around, some eager, others hesitant, all watching to see who had the grit to chew bravely. It wasn't just food, it was initiation. You weren't really part of the crew until you'd popped one in your mouth, grimaced, and swallowed like a champion. Saloon owners quickly saw the potential. In towns across Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas, prairie oysters became known as the cowboy's delicacy. They weren't on the menu for flavour alone, but for bravado. Order them, and you announced yourself as someone who could handle anything the West threw at you. Bandits, blizzards, or bull testicles on a plate. Refuse them, and you might spend the evening with your masculinity gently questioned by every gambler, rancher, and piano player in the room. The social pressure was real. A greenhorn stepping off the train might find himself dared into trying a prairie oyster within hours of arriving. Refuse, and you risked being branded softer than the cattle you'd come to wrangle. Accept, and you suddenly found yourself cheered by the same rough men who'd been ready to mock you moments before. Cowboys valued toughness, but toughness wasn't only measured with guns or fists. Sometimes it was measured by whether you could keep a straight face while chewing something no city slicker would dare touch. The dish also carried a streak of humour. Ranch hands made endless jokes about eating like a man, winking and elbowing each other as they passed the platter. Some nicknamed them swinging steaks, while others simply laughed at the horrified looks on newcomers' faces. The West could be brutal, but it also had a way of turning hardship into laughter. Prairie oysters were a reminder that even in a land of dust, danger, and hard labour, there was still room for absurdity, even if the absurdity was fried and served with vinegar. The flavour, for those who could get past the idea, wasn't bad at all. Crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, they absorbed whatever spices the cook used. Some preferred them with simple salt and pepper, others drenched them in hot sauce, mustard, or even ketchup once that condiment made its way westward. A few daring cooks experimented with chili powder, garlic, or paprika, turning them into fiery bites that left men sweating and swearing. Whatever the seasoning, the first shock was always psychological, not culinary. The tongue said fried meat, but the brain said, this used to be, well, you know. Branding festivals often turned the dish into a celebration. After the long, dusty, back-breaking work of herding and marking cattle, the evening meal became a party. There was music, dancing, gambling, and always a platter of prairie oysters on the table. Men toasted with rye whiskey, raised mugs of beer, and told exaggerated stories about how many they could eat in one sitting. Some swore downing a dozen would give you the strength of a bull. Others insisted it was the best cure for a hangover. Science didn't exactly back these claims, but on the frontier, belief was often as strong as fact. To outsiders, the idea of prairie oysters seemed grotesque, almost laughable. Eastern visitors sometimes recoiled, muttering about barbarism or savagery. But in the saloon's smoky light, those criticisms meant little. Cowboys weren't interested in dainty cutlets or imported wines. They wanted food that told a story of resilience, waste-not toughness, and a willingness to face the unthinkable head-on. Prairie oysters embodied all of that, and more. They were the Wild West on a plate. Strange, raw, unapologetic. Of course, not everyone enjoyed them. Plenty of men gagged after the first bite, coughing whiskey back into their cups. Others found excuses to avoid the dish entirely, suddenly claiming allergies or mysterious stomach ailments whenever the platter came around. But even those refusals became part of the story, fodder for endless teasing. A cowboy who skipped his share of prairie oysters might be haunted by jokes for months, his courage always just a little suspect in the eyes of his peers. It's strange to think about how this humble dish has survived. Today, Rocky Mountain oysters are still served in certain ranch towns and western festivals, often as a novelty to shock tourists. But back then, they were never novelty. They were necessity. Cattle provided everything, and to waste a single part was unthinkable. Prairie oysters weren't about daring city folk, they were about making the most of what you had, no matter how odd. The fact that they became a test of grit was just the saloon's way of adding spice to survival. Picture the scene. A rowdy evening in a Wyoming saloon. Cards slap against tables, boots stomp to a fiddle tune, whiskey sloshes in mugs. In the corner, a cook emerges from the back with a platter, steam rising, golden pieces piled high. He sets it down with a grin. The crowd cheers, men grab pieces, dip them in sauce, bite and laugh. Someone coughs, someone swears, someone raises a toast. And through it all, the platter empties, leaving only grease stains and a memory of one more frontier challenge faced and conquered. So while flapjacks filled bellies, stew tested stomachs, and beans kept men riding, prairie oysters did something else entirely. They bound cowboys together with a dare, a laugh, and a taste that lingered in memory long after the last bite was gone. They weren't just food. They were initiation, celebration, and a badge of belonging. Fried golden in the unforgiving heat of the Wild West. The sound of a poker game carried through the smoky saloon air, the shuffle of cards, the scrape of coins across scarred wood, the occasional curse muttered under a gambler's breath. But louder than all of it, more constant than the clatter of boots or the cough of dust-choked throats, was the bubbling hiss of coffee on the stove. Coffee was the West's black elixir, the six-shooter brew boiled so strong you half expected it to come out of the pot with spurs on. Cowboys didn't call it liquid tar for nothing. This was not the delicate caramel-swirled latte your barista scribbles hearts on. No, this was the drink that could jolt a man awake after riding 70 miles through wind and dust, or keep him upright at a poker table where losing focus meant losing your horse, your hat, and possibly your dignity. The preparation was brutally simple. Trail cooks didn't bother with fancy filters or dainty kettles. They grabbed a battered tin pot, dumped in a handful of coarse grounds, measurement being at best a wild guess, and filled it with water. The pot went straight onto the flames where it hissed and bubbled until the whole mixture looked more like mud than drink. Sometimes to settle the floating grounds they tossed in crushed eggshells or even a pinch of salt. The result? A brew that tasted less like coffee and more like a dare. Cowboys joked you could float a horseshoe on top, though more than one unlucky rider actually tried, and then wondered why his drink suddenly tasted of rusty iron. In saloons, the ritual wasn't much different. A blackened pot often sat on the stove all day, rarely emptied, always topped off with fresh water and more grounds. The longer it simmered, the darker and harsher it grew. By nightfall, it wasn't just strong enough to wake you up, it was strong enough to file your teeth. Patrons didn't complain. They slapped down coins or gold flakes for a tin cup, blew on the steam and braced themselves. It wasn't about flavour. It was about shock, survival, and the jolt that turned a half-asleep drifter into a man ready for another 12 hours of dust and trouble. Coffee was the true social glue of the frontier. Whiskey might steal the spotlight, but coffee kept the West moving. It was poured at dawn to get ranch hands saddled up, at midnight to keep gamblers alert, and at sunrise to rouse bleary travellers for the trail ahead. Men leaned on bar counters, fingers wrapped around tin mugs, trading stories about herds, storms, or near misses with outlaws. The steam fogged their faces, the bitterness bit their tongues, and for a moment they weren't alone in the endless sprawl of the frontier. They were just men, caffeinated into existence, pretending they could handle whatever came next. Sometimes barkeeps spiked it with whiskey, creating a concoction that warmed the chest and blurred the edges of reality. That wasn't just kindness, it was business. A customer drinking coffee lasted longer at the table, spent more coins, and maybe, just maybe, didn't collapse face down on the floorboards before paying his tab. Coffee, in its own way, kept the saloon profitable as much as the whiskey did. A gambler with steady hands was good for the game, a gambler asleep in his beans was not. Trail legends grew around the stuff. Cowboys swore coffee could cure snakebite, heartbreak, or a case of saddle sores. Others claimed the secret was drinking it scalding hot, so hot that it seared your tongue and left you unable to complain about the taste. One story told of a cook whose brew was so strong, a horse refused to drink water until it had sniffed the pot. Another tale insisted coffee kept coyotes at bay, though skeptics pointed out it was more likely the cowboys snoring after 3 mugs that scared the animals away. Still, for all its harshness, The drink held a kind of comfort. A cowboy on the trail could ride for days with little more than jerky in his saddlebag, but as long as he knew there was coffee waiting at camp, he felt anchored. The smell alone, rich, bitter, smoky, signalled a moment of rest, however brief. In the endless monotony of dust and hoofbeats, that mattered. It wasn't just caffeine, it was ritual, a pause in the chaos. The mugs themselves were part of the experience. Tin cups clattered on counters, dented from falls, scorched from campfires, blackened with stains that never washed out. Each cup told a story, of nights under the stars, of saloons where fights broke out mid-sip, of mornings so cold you hugged the mug like a long-lost friend. Sometimes the coffee was so hot it burned your lips, leaving you with a frontier badge of honour, the blistered mouth of a man who had chosen energy over self-preservation. City visitors often recoiled at the bitterness. Eastern gentlemen used to porcelain cups and cream, took one sip and nearly spat it back, coughing like they'd swallowed gunpowder. Cowboys found that hilarious. They leaned back in their chairs, grinning through their moustaches, and said things like, "Don't worry, tenderfoot, it'll put hair on your chest." The irony, of course, was that it also put ulcers in your stomach, but cowboys weren't much for medical disclaimers. Coffee was as much a weapon as a beverage. One cook, tired of complaints about his brew, once poured it into a chipped whiskey bottle and slapped a skull and crossbones label on it. He told the men it was poison, and watched as they drank it anyway, declaring it the best he'd ever made. Another time, a gambler splashed coffee onto a rival's hand mid-game, using the distraction to sweep coins from the pot. In a land where cards, guns, and fists were all fair play, hot coffee counted too. Women in frontier towns sometimes played with the recipe, adding cinnamon, cloves, or chicory root. Cowboys mocked them at first, but after a few sips many admitted the softer flavour wasn't half bad. Still, no cowboy would dare order it in public. That would be like wearing lace gloves to a gunfight. Coffee was meant to be black, bitter, and uncompromising, just like the trail itself. Anything else was a guilty pleasure, whispered about only when no one was listening. Imagine it. The saloon quiets for a moment. The piano silent. The laughter faded. Men cradle steaming mugs, staring into the dark liquid as if it holds the answers to survival. Outside, the wind howls through the dusty street, rattling shutters. But inside, there's warmth, caffeine, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, you can make it another day. Coffee didn't just keep men awake. It gave them courage, or at least the illusion of it. And sometimes, illusions were enough. So while flapjacks fed the belly, stew-tested grit and beans filled the long hours, coffee was the heartbeat. It pulsed through every saloon, every trail camp, every gambler's midnight vigil. It was bitter, black, and unforgiving, yet it kept the West alive. Without it, the cards would have gone unshuffled, the herds unridden, and the frontier unclaimed. Coffee was the West's truest spirit, harsh, relentless, and strangely comforting in its own brutal way. Every saloon in the West had its quirks. Some boasted battered pianos, others had a dealer who could shuffle so fast you swore his hands were smoke. But almost all of them had one thing in common: a jar of cloudy, floating eggs on the counter. Pickled eggs weren't glamorous. They weren't celebrated in cowboy songs or painted in dime novel illustrations, yet they were everywhere, lined up in big glass jars like pale moons bobbing in vinegar brine. If coffee was the saloon's fuel and whiskey its courage, pickled eggs were its insurance policy. Quick protein on demand, something to keep you upright while you gambled away your horse. The process of making them was simple, though the end result could be anything from tangy delight to an eye-watering punch in the mouth. Hard-boiled eggs were peeled, packed into jars, and drowned in vinegar laced with salt, mustard seeds, peppercorns, and sometimes chili peppers or beet juice. After a few days, they transformed into salty, sour little grenades of flavour. Some turned pink from beets, others fiery from peppers, but all had that unmistakable briny tang that slapped your tongue awake. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to last, and to fill. In the age before refrigeration, vinegar was magic, and eggs dunked in it were the closest thing to eternal life. Picture the scene. A cowboy stumbles into the saloon after 3 days on the trail, dust clinging to his coat, lips cracked from the sun. He doesn't have the coins for a full plate of beans, and he knows whiskey on an empty stomach is a bad gamble. So he tosses a few cents down, reaches into the cloudy jar, and pulls out an egg. A quick sprinkle of salt, maybe a dash of hot sauce if the barkeep is generous, and in 2 bites he's swallowed his supper. Cheap, fast, and surprisingly filling. That was the genius of pickled eggs, the West's version of fast food. They also had a ritual quality. Gamblers grabbed them between hands of poker, popping one into their mouths while cards were dealt. Drifters ate them at the bar while waiting for their next job. Ranch hands bought them by the pair, washing them down with beer before staggering back to the bunkhouse. The egg jar was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, drunk or sober, you probably stuck your hand in that brine at some point. And yes, everyone ignored the health concerns of communal vinegar dipping. Frontier stomachs were tougher than railroad spikes. Of course, the eggs themselves weren't always consistent. Some batches came out pleasantly tangy, with just enough salt to make you thirsty for another drink. Others, neglected too long, developed a smell that could empty half the saloon in minutes. Cowboys joked that you could tell how honest a town was by the state of its egg jar. If the eggs looked clean and well tended, the barkeep probably ran a respectable game. If the eggs floated like corpses in a haunted pond, well, maybe keep one hand on your revolver while you drank. Still, even the worst pickled eggs found eager takers. Hunger lowered standards and whiskey lowered them further. Men too broke for beans, too proud to beg, or too drunk to care happily gnawed on rubbery eggs that might have been soaking since the last cattle drive. They grimaced, chewed, and chased the bite with a shot of rye. In the Wild West, survival often came wrapped in vinegar. The cultural lore around pickled eggs grew almost comical. Some claimed they cured hangovers, their acidity shocking the body back into balance. Others insisted they were an aphrodisiac, though whether that was true or simply a cruel joke on drunk cowboys is anyone's guess. A few gamblers swore eating one before a poker hand gave them luck, though skeptics noted it was mostly just an excuse to keep chewing loudly while bluffing. The egg jar became part of the saloon's rhythm, a background constant you didn't notice until you were desperate. And desperate was common. Food in saloons wasn't always cheap. Beans and pork cost more than some men could spare. A roasted buffalo hump was a luxury only gamblers with winnings could afford. But an egg? That was within reach. A nickel for a bite of protein meant you could walk out without collapsing in the street. For many cowboys, the egg was less snack than salvation. Pickled eggs also had their role in bar fights. More than one saloon story tells of a drunk throwing an egg at a rival. The vinegar splashing across faces, the sulphur stink adding insult to injury. Some barkeeps used them as peacekeepers, tossing an egg into the hand of an angry cowboy and saying, "Chew this before you chew him." It worked sometimes, though other times it just meant someone got brined before the brawl began. Eastern travellers wrote about the jars with a mix of fascination and horror. City folks weren't used to seeing food floating in liquid on bar counters. They described the jars as eerie, the eggs pale as ghosts, the brine cloudy as swamp water. To them, the sight was a warning. To cowboys, it was a welcome beacon of sustenance. Context was everything. The eggs weren't always plain either. Some saloons experimented with spices. A jar in New Mexico might reek of chili, sending unsuspecting eaters into coughing fits. A jar in Kansas might turn eggs pink with beets. A touch of elegance in an otherwise grimy room. A jar in Texas might carry garlic so strong it clung to your breath for days. Each saloon had its own signature, its own silent boast that their eggs were different, better, or at least less likely to kill you. But the real magic wasn't in the flavour. It was in the act. Reaching into that jar was like shaking hands with the frontier itself. It said, "Here we waste nothing. Here we eat what we can afford. Here, vinegar makes everything last, even hope." That glass jar, fogged with brine and fingerprints, was more than storage. It was survival sealed tight, waiting for the next hungry soul to come along. Imagine yourself at that bar. The piano clangs in the corner, dice clatter on wood, laughter breaks into shouts. You're tired, broke, and too stubborn to leave. The barkeep slides the jar toward you. You pull out an egg, still warm from the vinegar sting. You bite, grimacing as the sour tang floods your mouth. For a moment your stomach steadies, your mind clears, and you feel almost human again. In a world of dust and danger, that tiny moment matters. So while flapjacks brought comfort, stew brought grit, beans brought endurance, and prairie oysters brought bravado. Pickled eggs brought something else entirely: resilience. They were the frontier's pocket-sized miracle, the snack that kept gamblers awake, drunks on their feet, and cowboys moving forward. Sour, rubbery, sometimes downright terrifying, but unforgettable. The air in the saloon wasn't always thick with beef fat or vinegar brine. Sometimes, drifting above the smoke and the clatter, there came a gentler scent. The earthy, gamey perfume of rabbit stew simmering slowly in a cast-iron pot. If beans were the daily grind and flapjacks the survival cake, rabbit was the quiet luxury of the frontier. Not because it was rare, but because it carried a sense of comfort, of warmth, of sitting at a table and feeling, however briefly, like civilization had followed you into the dust. Rabbits, after all, were everywhere. The prairie practically hopped with them. Traps, rifles, or even a quick chase with dogs could secure a meal. And unlike beef, rabbit didn't require a full herd or a slaughterhouse. It was small game, practical for families, saloons, and trail cooks alike. And when beef grew scarce, or pork too expensive, or buffalo herds dwindled under relentless rifles, rabbit filled the gap with a lean, delicate meat that took to stews as if it had been invented for the pot. The cooking ritual was almost always the same. First, brown the meat in fat, pork grease, tallow, or whatever dripped from the last frying pan. The sizzling filled the room with a savoury crackle, as if promising that no matter how thin your pockets, you were about to eat something good. Next came onions, chopped rough, tossed into the skillet until they turned golden and soft. Then potatoes, carrots, maybe turnips if they were around, cut into chunks that would soften and absorb the rabbit's flavour. Water or broth was poured over, the lid clanged shut, and the whole thing simmered low and slow for hours. The result? Meat so tender it slid off the bone, vegetables sweetened and softened, broth thick enough to coat your spoon. In Arizona or New Mexico saloons, the recipe took on spice. Chilies were tossed in, their heat blooming through the pot. Garlic, cumin, maybe even a sprinkle of wild herbs, sage, mesquite, or whatever the desert offered. The stew came out smoky, spicy and earthy, tasting of both Spanish kitchens and native traditions blended into something new. Cowboys swore that one spoonful could chase the chill of a desert night, while gamblers claimed the heat sharpened their wits at the table. Whether true or not, no one complained as long as their bowl stayed full. What made rabbit stew special wasn't its extravagance, but its humility. It was the dish you didn't boast about, the one you ate quietly at a corner table, letting the warmth seep into your bones. Unlike prairie oysters, it carried no dare. Unlike beans, it wasn't endless. Unlike flapjacks, it wasn't heavy enough to knock you into a food coma. It was simply a reminder that comfort still existed, even out on the edge of everything. Cowboys often joked that rabbit was the one animal foolish enough to volunteer for dinner. The prairie teemed with them, darting into traps, lingering too long in lantern light. A clever hunter could bring back enough for a whole pot within an afternoon, and because rabbits multiplied faster than rumours in a saloon, there was little guilt about eating them. If buffalo roasts carried a hint of tragedy, a symbol of herds disappearing, rabbit stew carried none. It was abundance that seemed inexhaustible, as if the land itself wanted to feed you. Families in frontier towns loved it too. Mothers stewed rabbit when beef was too dear, serving bowls to children who had never tasted anything finer. The meat was lean, healthy, and plentiful. For many young settlers, rabbit wasn't just dinner, it was childhood. The memory of that savoury broth, that tender meat, stuck long after they'd grown old, long after the saloons and towns had changed. Saloons, of course, had their own flair. Some served rabbit stew with sourdough bread on the side, the crust perfect for soaking up broth. Others paired it with cornbread, crumbling pieces into the bowl until it became a thick porridge. And if you were lucky enough to sit in a town flush with rail deliveries, you might even get a sprinkle of dried herbs shipped in from far away. Imagine rosemary or thyme floating in your bowl, a taste of Europe in the middle of Wyoming dust. For a cowboy, that was practically fine dining. The social ritual mattered as much as the flavour. Men hunched over steaming bowls, shoulders brushing, spoons clattering against tin. Conversation slowed as mouths filled, the only sound the soft hum of satisfaction. Outside, the wind might howl, coyotes might prowl, but inside, rabbit stew anchored everyone. It wasn't just calories. It was reassurance, a reminder that there was still warmth in the world. Not every stew turned out perfect, of course. Sometimes the rabbit was overcooked until it turned stringy, the vegetables burned at the bottom, the broth watery from impatience. Cowboys grumbled, but they ate anyway. Hunger was the great equalizer. One man's complaint about bland broth was another man's grateful prayer for hot food. And honestly, after a long ride, even shoe leather might have tasted good if it had been simmered with onions long enough. There was even superstition tied to rabbit stew. Some claimed eating it before a cattle drive brought luck, as if the rabbit's quickness lent speed to the herd. Others insisted it kept illness at bay, the lean meat strengthening the body. A few unlucky men swore it brought bad dreams, nightmares of being chased through prairie grass by enormous, vengeful rabbits. Whether true or not, the stew pot kept bubbling, because in the end, belief mattered less than hunger. Gamblers found poetry in it too. A warm bowl between hands of cards steadied nerves, kept men from drinking too much whiskey too quickly. Some even dipped bread into their bowls mid-game, chewing slowly as they calculated bets. There was strategy in stew, or so they said. Something about broth calming the mind. Whether strategy or superstition, the rabbit kept them company through long, smoky nights. Now picture yourself there, the lantern light flickering, the smell of chilies and onions rising from the pot. The bartender ladles out a bowl, sets it in front of you. Steam curls up, warming your face. You break a piece of bread, dip it, taste the broth. It's savoury, earthy, with just a whisper of heat that lingers on your tongue. You chew, you swallow, and for a moment, the rough edges of the world soften. The poker table fades, the gun at your hip feels lighter, and you almost believe the West could be kind. Rabbit stew didn't inspire legends like buffalo roasts or tests of courage like prairie oysters, but it lived quietly in the heart of the frontier. It was the dish cowboys remembered years later when they thought about the trail. The food that whispered of home kitchens even when eaten in rowdy saloons. The taste that told you survival can still feel gentle sometimes. So while flapjacks sank heavy, beans filled endlessly, stew of organs tested grit, and coffee burned awake, rabbit stew did something different. It comforted. It soothed. It reminded you that even in a world of dust and danger, the land could still give back something tender. By the time the poker chips clattered into the early hours and the last fiddle note had faded into smoke, there was still one dish a cowboy could count on. Biscuits with molasses. No fancy cuts of meat. No daring bravado like prairie oysters. No organ meat stew to test your courage. Just a plate of humble flour biscuits hot from a Dutch oven, dripping with the only sweetness the frontier could reliably provide. It was the kind of meal that didn't look like much but carried more comfort than gold nuggets ever could. Biscuits were quick work for a saloon cook. Flour, lard, salt, maybe sour milk if it hadn't turned completely rebellious yet. The dough was slapped together, pressed into rounds and baked in cast-iron skillets or Dutch ovens over open flame. They came out crisp on the outside, flaky inside, each one warm enough to thaw frozen fingers after a night ride. You didn't need butter, though on rare days butter did appear like a visiting angel. What you needed was molasses. Molasses was the West's liquid treasure, thick, dark, and sticky as midnight. It travelled by rail in heavy barrels, sloshing across miles of prairie. Unlike sugar, which spoiled easily in damp wagons, molasses kept for months. When a saloon landed a shipment, it poured that syrup like it was gold. Cowboys lined up with plates, biscuits steaming, waiting for the barkeep to drizzle a slow, rich ribbon across the top. It wasn't delicate, it wasn't subtle, but to a man who'd been chewing jerky for days, it was heaven flowing like tar. The combination was magic. The biscuit, flaky and salty, softened under the weight of molasses. The sweetness sank into every layer, oozing until your fingers stuck together. You licked them clean, not out of manners but necessity, or in the West, no sweetness went to waste. Each bite carried a contrast. The dryness of flour against the syrup's richness. The crunch of crust against the smooth flood of sugar. It was primitive, yes, but it worked. And for many cowboys, it was the only reminder that life could still taste sweet in a land mostly defined by dust and grit. Late-night biscuits became a kind of tradition. When saloon supplies ran low, when the beans had been eaten and the stew pot scraped dry, cooks turned to biscuits. They could whip up a batch quickly, feed a crowd, and still have something left for breakfast. Cowboys too broke for steak or buffalo roast, could still afford a biscuit. It was democratic food. No one left without at least a taste of flour and molasses. The smell of baking biscuits filled saloons with a different kind of comfort. Instead of vinegar tang or greasy smoke, The air carried a warm, homey scent. Men slumped at tables lifted their heads, nostrils twitching like hounds. For a moment the saloon didn't feel like a den of gambling and whiskey. It felt like a kitchen, like a place where someone's mother might still be alive, pulling bread from the oven. The illusion was short-lived, but in the West, illusions were often as good as truth. Cowboys from the South especially treasured the dish. Biscuits and molasses stirred childhood memories, Sunday suppers, family kitchens, voices now long gone. Some men closed their eyes as they chewed, letting the sweetness carry them back across miles and years. In a land where loneliness was as common as dust, molasses was more than sugar. It was nostalgia poured thick across a plate. Not every batch turned out perfect, of course. Frontier ovens were temperamental. Biscuits burned on the bottom, stayed raw in the middle, or turned so hard you needed a revolver to crack them open. Cowboys ate them anyway. Hunger and molasses covered a multitude of culinary sins. And if the biscuits were truly inedible, well, a bad batch could still patch a leaking saddlebag or serve as emergency poker chips. Waste nothing. That was the rule. There were jokes too. Cowboys swore molasses could fix anything. Stiff joints? Rub on molasses. Cracked lips? Molasses. Lonely night? A spoonful of molasses and you'd forget what you were missing. They teased that biscuits and molasses were the only romance many men would ever know, and honestly, with how tenderly some of them licked their plates, it wasn't far from truth. Saloon culture made it more dramatic. The barkeep would ladle molasses with a kind of showmanship, letting it drizzle slowly, stretching the anticipation. Men leaned forward, eyes fixed on the syrup's slow descent, groaning if a rival got a thicker pour. Fights had been started over less. In some towns you could measure a man's luck by the shine of molasses on his plate. Win a poker hand and the barkeep gave you a double drizzle. Lose, and you scraped the bottom of the barrel. Molasses also had the strange gift of slowing time. In a world that moved fast, cattle stampeding, guns drawn in seconds, trains roaring through, molasses dared to crawl. It oozed across biscuits at its own pace, ignoring hunger, ignoring urgency. Cowboys waited, groaning, as if the syrup was taunting them. Patience is the real frontier skill, and when the sweetness finally arrived, it rewarded them tenfold. Travellers carried the memory with them. Years later, men who'd crossed the plains recalled not the whiskey or even the poker games, but the simple taste of biscuits dripping with molasses. The dish lodged itself in memory precisely because it was so basic. In a land of hardship, simplicity became sacred. Sweetness became rare, and a hot biscuit at midnight became something like grace. Imagine yourself in that saloon. The lamps gutter low, the piano silent, the gamblers dozing. The cook slides a skillet onto the counter, biscuits steaming, crusts browned. You grab one, tear it open, watch the steam curl out. The barkeep tips a ladle, and thick dark molasses drizzles down, slow as dusk. You bite, chew, and close your eyes. For one moment, the world softens, the dust disappears, the guns quiet, and all that's left is warmth, sweetness, and the quiet hum of your own breath. So while flapjacks gave fuel, son of a gun stew gave grit, beans gave endurance, prairie oysters gave bravado, and coffee gave fire, biscuits with molasses gave something else entirely. Comfort, sweetness in the middle of struggle, a reminder that even the roughest frontier had room for a taste of home. The saloon could be rowdy, smoky, even desperate at times, but nothing quieted the room like the arrival of buffalo roast. It wasn't beans bubbling endlessly on the stove, or biscuits whipped up to stretch the night. This was the feast, the dish you ordered when your pockets jingled with poker winnings or your cattle drive had just paid off. Buffalo wasn't just meat, it was status. And in the Wild West, nothing spoke louder than laying your coin down for a plate carved straight from the king of the prairie. Before cattle herds stampeded across the plains, before railroads hauled beef to every dusty town, the buffalo ruled. Dark, lean, and gamey, its meat carried a flavour closer to venison than beef. Hunters brought in whole carcasses, their hides destined for blankets and coats, their bones for tools, their meat for hungry men. Saloons that managed to get a buffalo roast made sure everyone knew it. A hand-lettered sign out front might brag, "Roast tonight," and cowboys would shuffle in with a hunger that beans alone could never tame. Preparation mattered. The prized cut was the hump, a thick mound of fat and muscle that sat between the animal's shoulders. Roasted slowly over open flame or baked in a cast-iron oven, basted with its own fat and maybe a handful of herbs, it became tender enough to melt when sliced. Other cuts were cooked in slabs, turned on spits until the outside charred and the inside glowed pink. The smell was intoxicating, a mix of smoke, fat, and something wild that clung to your clothes for hours. When the barkeep finally carved the roast and ladled gravy thick as mud across the plate, men leaned in like they were witnessing Holy Communion. Buffalo roast wasn't cheap. A plate could cost more than a week's worth of beans. But gamblers fresh from a lucky hand didn't care. Miners who'd struck gold in the hills didn't care. Cowboys paid gladly, just for the chance to bite into something that felt like celebration. One slice of buffalo roast meant you weren't surviving anymore. You were living. You weren't just a drifter scraping through another dusty night. You were a man who had earned a feast, and feasts mattered. Saloons were rarely polite places, but when buffalo was served, there was a shift. Men set down their cards, tipped hats back, and gave the roast their full attention. Plates clattered, knives sawed, and voices softened into a low hum of satisfaction. The food itself became a pause button, suspending the usual chaos of whiskey and wagers. In that moment, the saloon wasn't just a place of smoke and noise. It was a dining hall, a community, a place where strangers shared in the same bounty. Of course, the very demand that made buffalo roast so prized also carried tragedy. Herds once stretched across the horizon, black waves of muscle and fur rolling over the prairie. But hunting, for hides, for sport, for meat, drove their numbers down at terrifying speed. Saloons were part of that cycle, buying roasts to lure hungry men and keep coins flowing. Cowboys joked about buffalo on every table, not realizing that joke would fade into regret when the herds dwindled to near extinction by the late 1800s. Eating buffalo roast was both celebration and elegy, though few recognized it at the time. Still, the taste left its mark. Men described it as rich, but not greasy, hearty but not heavy. Some swore it gave them more strength than beef, that it carried the wildness of the prairie itself in every bite. Others said it was simply the best thing they'd ever eaten, proof that the West still had abundance to offer even in the middle of dust and hardship. Buffalo roast became more than food. It became memory, the kind of story you told years later when you wanted to recall the best night of your life. Imagine the scene. A crowded saloon in Dodge City, the lamps burning low, the piano still playing even as the player's fingers cramp. A hunter bursts through the doors, dragging behind him a wagon with a fresh buffalo quarter. The room erupts, men cheering, barkeeps already sharpening knives, cooks shouting for space at the stove. Hours later, the roast arrives on tables, juices running, gravy thick. Cowboys lean forward, forks stabbing, voices muffled by mouthfuls of meat. Whiskey flows, laughter rises, and for one night the saloon feels less like survival and more like celebration. Travellers from the east were astonished by it. Newspapers carried stories of buffalo roast served in frontier towns, describing portions so large they dwarfed city meals. Visitors gawked at the size of the cuts, the sheer spectacle of carving a hump roast in front of a crowd. To them, it seemed barbaric and magnificent all at once, proof that the frontier was still untamed, still full of plenty, and yet lurking behind the marvel was a shadow, the knowledge that plenty could not last forever. Even so, the roast endured as a symbol. To cowboys, it meant success. To gamblers, it meant fortune. To drifters, it meant they had finally landed in the right saloon at the right time. And to all, it meant something more than beans or biscuits ever could. A taste of glory, fleeting and rare, but unforgettable. The roast had its rituals too. Some men demanded it be served with potatoes, others with bread to soak up the juices. A few saloons experimented with sauces, tossing in onions, garlic, even the occasional splash of whiskey to deepen the flavour. Each plate carried its own twist, but the essence never changed. Buffalo, roasted slow, carved hot, devoured quickly. Now picture yourself there. You're tired from the trail, broke from bad cards, but tonight you've got just enough coin left in your pocket. The barkeep lifts his carving knife, slices a thick slab, lays it on your plate with a ladle of gravy. The steam curls upward, rich and wild. You cut, you chew, and the taste fills your mouth with something that feels bigger than food. It feels like triumph, like the prairie itself has given you a gift. You close your eyes, and for one moment, You forget the dust, the danger, the loneliness. All that exists is roast, warmth, and the hum of voices around you. So while flapjacks gave survival, organ stew gave grit, beans gave strength, oysters gave bravado, coffee gave fire, eggs gave resilience, and rabbit gave comfort. Buffalo roast gave something rarer. It gave celebration. It gave a taste of abundance in a land mostly known for scarcity. And though its legacy carries both nostalgia and regret, the memory of buffalo roast lingers, smoky and wild, like the echo of hooves across the vanished plains. The saloon, with its smoke-stained walls and clinking glasses, wasn't known for delicacy. Meals were usually about survival. Beans to fill the belly, pork to fuel the ride, coffee to keep eyes open through endless nights. But every once in a while, a dish appeared that reminded cowboys of kitchens far away, of orchards and autumn evenings, of mothers baking in iron stoves while leaves fell outside. That dish was dried apple pie. Fresh fruit was almost impossible to keep on the trail. It spoiled too quickly, bruised in wagons, rotted in the desert heat. But dried apples, shriveled slices packed in sacks and hauled by rail or wagon, could last months. When softened again in water, simmered with sugar, and kissed with cinnamon or nutmeg, those leathery scraps transformed into something fragrant, sweet, and almost magical. Saloons treasured dried apples the way gamblers treasured a lucky deck. They didn't show up every day, but when they did, the whole room seemed to lean toward the oven. The process was part science, part sorcery. First, the apples were soaked until they plumped just enough to look edible. Then they were boiled down with sugar, maybe a drizzle of molasses if the cook was feeling generous, plus spices scavenged from whatever the rail had delivered that month. Cinnamon sticks, ground nutmeg, sometimes even a clove or two. The mixture thickened into a sticky, spiced filling that smelled like home. Finally, it was poured into a crust made of flour and lard, dense and sturdy, designed not for beauty but for survival in an oven that might burn hotter than a branding fire. When the pies came out, the room shifted. The air filled with a warm sweetness that silenced poker tables, that made even the drunkest cowboy straighten in his chair. Plates were passed, forks clattered, and suddenly men who had faced storms, stampedes, and outlaws looked like children again, eyes wide at the first slice. The crust might be tough, but the filling sang. Tart, sweet, spiced, it carried a memory that no amount of whiskey could drown. Cowboys didn't linger over most meals, but apple pie slowed them down. They took smaller bites, chewed longer, savoured the taste. It wasn't just dessert, it was nostalgia. For men who had left families behind, who hadn't seen their mothers or sisters or wives in years, that pie was the closest thing to going home. A bite might bring back the image of an orchard at harvest, baskets full of fruit, laughter in the crisp air. Another might remind them of a warm kitchen, safe from winter winds. In the Wild West, where safety and sweetness were rare, dried apple pie carried more weight than any roast or stew. Not every saloon could manage it, of course. Ingredients were scarce, ovens temperamental. A pie might come out burnt at the edges or soggy in the middle. Cowboys didn't complain. Even a bad pie was still pie, and in the land of jerky and vinegar eggs, that counted as luxury. Some joked that the crust was so hard they could stop a bullet. Others swore the filling was so sweet it made whiskey taste bitter by comparison. Complaints were part of the fun. The truth was, men lined up for every slice, no matter how flawed. Apple pie also carried its own kind of status. If a gambler had a good night, he ordered pie for the table. If a cowboy had finished a brutal drive, he celebrated with pie. If a saloon wanted to draw customers from a rival down the street, it baked pie. Whiskey might bring men in the door, but apple pie kept them seated, plates in hand, forks scraping until nothing was left but crumbs. There were even tales of fights breaking out over the last slice. One story told of a pair of miners in Montana who nearly shot each other when the barkeep announced only one piece remained. Another described a gambler who offered to put the slice in the pot during a poker game. Winner takes pie. The gambler lost, of course, and spent the rest of the night sulking into his coffee, while the winner ate slowly, savouring every bite just to rub it in. The pie wasn't always eaten plain. Sometimes saloons served it with a drizzle of cream if a cow had been milked nearby. Other times men poured whiskey straight onto their slice, letting the crust soak it up until each bite burned and sweetened at once. Improvised, yes, but improvisation was the frontier's real recipe book. Eastern visitors often remarked on the pies in their travel journals. They described them as coarse but charming, marvelling at how something so simple could taste so good after weeks of beans and salt pork. They laughed at the sturdy crusts but admitted the filling was heavenly. To them, it was evidence that even in rough towns filled with outlaws and gamblers, humanity clung to its small comforts. Civilization wasn't measured only by railroads and lawmen. Sometimes it was measured by pie cooling on a windowsill. Imagine the moment. The piano stills, the chatter fades, and you sit with a tin fork in hand. The slice before you isn't elegant. The crust is uneven, the filling unevenly spread. But the smell, oh, the smell is warm spice and tart sweetness. You take a bite, and the crust crumbles just enough to give way to sticky apples. The flavour bursts on your tongue, cinnamon and sugar mingling with tart fruit. For one moment you're not in a saloon surrounded by guns and smoke. You're in a kitchen you barely remember, where someone once loved you enough to bake. That's what made dried apple pie unforgettable. It wasn't just dessert, it was memory, comfort and longing baked into every slice. Cowboys remembered it years later, long after they'd forgotten the names of towns or the faces of fellow riders. Pie was proof that even in the harshest places sweetness survived. So while flapjacks filled stomachs, organ stews tested grit, beans carried men through the trail, oysters proved bravado, coffee jolted them awake, eggs gave cheap resilience, and rabbit stew soothed. Dried apple pie gave something rarer, nostalgia. It reminded cowboys that they were still human, still connected to the homes and lives they'd left behind. In a land of dust and danger, one bite could carry them back to simpler days. The saloon counter in the Old West was never bare, even when the stew pot had boiled down to a sticky film and the bean kettle scraped empty. There was one snack bartenders kept ready for every drifter, gambler, or ranch hand who stumbled in. Jerky. Strips of dried game, venison, elk, antelope, even the occasional bear stacked on wooden plates or hung in bundles from hooks. Jerky wasn't flashy, but it was dependable, like the horse tied outside or the revolver slung low on a hip. In a land where food spoiled fast and travel was constant, jerky was the one companion that never quit. Jerky started long before the saloon. Native peoples across the plains had perfected the craft, slicing meat thin, salting it, smoking it, and letting the prairie wind do the rest. Cowboys adopted the practice eagerly because nothing else survived the saddlebag so well. A chunk of jerky could ride for weeks through rain, dust or snow, and still be edible. Chewy, salty, stubborn as leather but edible. When saloons opened their doors to weary men, they knew jerky was the one snack that would never run out, no matter how rowdy the crowd or how poor the kitchen stores. Preparation varied, but the essence stayed the same. Hunters cut strips of fresh meat, sometimes deer, sometimes buffalo, sometimes whatever unlucky beast had crossed the wrong rifle. They rubbed it with salt, sometimes adding pepper, sage or red pepper flakes if they wanted flair. Then the strips were laid across wooden racks, smoked slowly over mesquite or hickory, or left to dry in the sun until they stiffened into what looked suspiciously like rawhide. The result was tough, chewy, and brimming with flavour that clung to your teeth long after you swallowed. It wasn't refined, but it was the taste of survival. In saloons, jerky wasn't just food, it was entertainment. Bartenders laid out small plates with mugs of beer, the salty chew making men drink more. Some bars served jerky alongside pickles or cheese, a rustic attempt at pairing before pairing was a fashionable word. Cowboys gnawed on strips as they watched poker games unfold, jaws working slowly while eyes tracked cards and coins. The snack kept hands busy, mouths full, and tempers slightly steadier, though not always steady enough to prevent a brawl. Jerky had its quirks. Too dry, and it could chip a tooth. Too fresh, and it went rancid before you finished your ride. The best jerky struck a balance. Smoky, pliable, chewy, without being punishing. Cowboys argued endlessly about which state or territory made the best. Texans swore by spicy jerky dusted with chili powder, while men from Montana praised their hickory-smoked elk. Arguments sometimes escalated into bets, which escalated into fights, which escalated into more jerky eaten while the sheriff dragged someone out by the collar. It wasn't just about taste. Jerky carried pride. A man who hunted, prepared, and dried his own jerky proved his self-reliance. Sharing a strip was a gesture of camaraderie, a way of saying, "You're one of us, at least for tonight." Refusing jerky, on the other hand, invited mockery. City travellers who turned up their noses at the leathery snack were teased mercilessly. "What's wrong?" cowboys jeered. "Afraid your teeth ain't trained for the frontier?" In truth, the joke was fair. Chewing jerky was less about eating and more about wrestling your jaw into submission. Yet for all its toughness, jerky had a strange intimacy. Picture two cowboys by the fire, stars overhead, passing a strip back and forth. No words, just the quiet sound of chewing, the occasional snap of a tooth against tough sinew. In that silence, jerky became more than food. It was company, something to fill the space where loneliness might otherwise creep in. Saloons sometimes dressed it up. A barkeep might dice jerky into beans, softening it with heat. A cook might grind it down, mixing it with fat and spices to make a sort of frontier sausage. But most of the time, jerky stayed simple. Whole strips, salted and smoked, torn apart by calloused hands and determined teeth. Its simplicity was its strength. No preparation, no fuss, no waiting. You could walk in broke, order a beer, and still find a strip of jerky waiting to keep you upright. It had practical uses too. Cowboys swore jerky doubled as tinder in a pinch. Salty, greasy enough to catch a spark. Others used it as trade, swapping strips for cartridges, tobacco, or favours. A piece of jerky might even patch a hole in a boot long enough to finish the ride. Waste nothing. The frontier motto applied even to dried meat that looked suspiciously like leather because, in many ways, it practically was. Gamblers made their own rituals with it. Some chewed jerky slow, timing bites with the rhythm of the game. Others swore chewing helped them bluff, hiding smirks behind jaws in motion. More than one poker game ended with jerky scattered across the table, forgotten when tempers rose and fists flew. Later, when the dust settled, someone inevitably picked the strips back up, brushed off the sawdust and kept chewing. Hygiene standards were negotiable. Visitors from the East wrote about jerky with fascination. They described it as pungent, unyielding, and not unlike gnawing a boot. Yet even they admitted its appeal. There was something satisfying about food that didn't spoil, didn't crumble, didn't complain. Jerky was stubborn, like the men who ate it. It demanded effort but rewarded persistence, much like the frontier itself. Imagine yourself in that saloon. The lamplight flickers, shadows crawl across the walls. You lean against the counter, mug in hand, while the bartender slides a strip of jerky toward you. You bite, teeth straining, flavour blooming slow, smoke, salt, a hint of wildness. You chew, swallow, and feel the warmth spread down into your chest. Around you, cowboys laugh, gamble, curse, and drink. But in that moment, you're part of it all. You've joined the rhythm of jaws and mugs, the simple communion of shared survival. So while flapjacks brought comfort, stews brought grit, beans brought strength, oysters brought bravado, coffee brought fire, eggs brought resilience, and rabbit brought solace, jerky brought something simpler, constancy. It was the snack that never left, the food that asked nothing but patience and gave back the taste of smoke and stubbornness. It was survival in your pocket, toughness between your teeth, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest things endure the longest. If jerky was the snack that never quit, then cornbread and chili were the saloon's way of proving the frontier had flavour beyond salt and smoke. The dish didn't come from nowhere. It was born at a crossroads where Mexican kitchens, native traditions, and southern settlers collided in one bubbling pot. Out of that collision came chili, fiery, filling, and as unmistakably Western as the sound of spurs on a wooden floor. And if you wanted to tame the fire, or at least give your tongue a fighting chance, you reached for cornbread, golden and humble, baked right alongside it. Together they made one of the most enduring pairings in frontier cooking. Chili, as cowboys knew it, wasn't the neat competition stew we see today with judges frowning into porcelain cups. No, it was rough, improvised, and dictated entirely by what the cook had on hand. Dried chilies ground into flakes, beans if they were available, hunks of beef or venison, onions chopped coarse, garlic when luck struck. Everything went into a black kettle, simmering low until the air in the saloon grew thick with spice. Sometimes it was so hot it made men sweat through their hats. Other times it was mild enough that you wondered if the cook had run out of peppers and simply hoped no one noticed. Either way, it filled bowls, cleared sinuses, and woke even the sleepiest gambler from his whiskey haze. Cornbread was the anchor to that storm. Cornmeal was cheap, durable, and easy to store, making it a staple in saloon pantries. Mixed with lard, water, and sometimes eggs, it baked into firm loaves or skillet rounds, their crusts crisp, their insides soft and slightly sweet. Cornbread could be eaten plain, crumbled into chili like golden gravel, or drenched in molasses for dessert. Its versatility kept it on nearly every menu west of the Mississippi. Most importantly, it gave cowboys a way to scoop chili without setting their tongues entirely ablaze. The pairing became ritual. A bowl of chili steaming hot, a hunk of cornbread perched on the edge. Cowboys broke off pieces, dunked them, chewed slow, and let the fire and corn balance each other out. Conversations around tables blurred into sniffles and coughs, men fanning their mouths, eyes watering as they insisted they weren't overwhelmed. Pride was at stake. No cowboy wanted to admit chili had beaten him. The braver ones asked for seconds, their bravado measured not in bullets fired but peppers swallowed. Chili competitions started informally in saloons. Who made the best pot? Whose spice had the right balance? Who could sneak in the most ingredients without anyone noticing? Some cooks added beer for richness, others added chocolate, a tradition borrowed from Mexican mole. A few daring souls slipped in prairie herbs, giving the stew an earthy, unpredictable flavour. The debates were endless, the judgments subjective, and the bowls always empty by night's end. Cornbread had its rivalries too. Some cooks swore by sweet cornbread, lacing the batter with sugar or molasses until it bordered on cake. Others insisted cornbread should be savoury, no sweetness allowed, baked dense enough to double as a weapon in a bar fight. Cowboys ate both without complaint, though they teased endlessly about which version was real. More than one poker game dissolved into arguments over cornbread that ended with fists flying and crumbs scattered across the floorboards. For drifters, the combo of chili and cornbread was salvation. You could walk into a saloon broke, scrape together a few coins, and walk out with a full belly. Chili filled you with warmth that lasted through cold nights on the trail, and cornbread gave you the energy to ride at dawn. It was fuel, but also something more, a taste of community, of shared pots and passed loaves. Around a table of chili bowls, the distance between strangers narrowed. You weren't just eating stew, you were joining the family of the frontier. The smell alone could anchor a room. Chili simmering for hours released waves of spice that clung to clothes and hair. Cornbread baking added a toasty sweetness that balanced the air. Together, they created a perfume of survival that drifted out the swinging doors, pulling men inside. Some cowboys claimed they could smell chili from a mile away, their stomachs dragging them like compass needles to the nearest saloon pot. Imagine the scene. It's a cold evening in a Texas town. Outside, the wind blows dust across the street, rattling shutters and howling like a stray dog. Inside, the saloon is alive with warmth. A kettle bubbles in the corner, the scent of chilies and beef wrapping around gamblers and ranch hands alike. The cook slides a skillet of cornbread onto the counter, crust golden, edges hissing from hot fat. Plates are filled, mugs are poured, and suddenly the room quiets. Cowboys lean in, spoons clattering, cornbread breaking apart between rough fingers. For a few blessed minutes, all noise fades into the rhythm of eating. Eastern travellers wrote about the combination with awe. They described bowls of chili so hot they made men weep openly, and cornbread so dense it could dent a wall. To them the pairing seemed barbaric and ingenious all at once. How could such rough food taste so good? The answer was simple: hunger, spice, and the alchemy of necessity. The frontier had no patience for fancy sauces or delicate pastries, but it understood perfectly how to turn cornmeal and chilies into a feast. Chili also became a metaphor. Cowboys joked that a man's character could be judged by his chili. Too bland, and he was timid. Too spicy, and he was reckless. Just right, and he was steady, dependable. The kind of man you wanted beside you in a cattle drive or a poker game. Cornbread, meanwhile, was called the Great Forgiver, because even the worst chili tasted bearable when soaked up with golden crumbs. Together they weren't just food, they were philosophy. Now picture yourself at that table. The bowl before you steams, the cornbread glows golden. You break off a piece, dunk it into the chili, and lift it to your mouth. The spice hits first, a fiery bloom that prickles your tongue. Then the cornbread softens it, sweet and warm, balancing the heat. You chew, swallow, and feel warmth spread through your chest, down your arms, out into your weary bones. Around you, cowboys laugh, cough, slap backs, and argue about whose chili is best. You don't need to join in. The food itself has already given you belonging, so while flapjacks fed, stew tested grit, beans fueled, oysters proved pride, coffee burned awake, eggs carried men through, rabbit soothed, pie comforted, and jerky endured, chili and cornbread did something grander. They gave the West its fire. They turned hunger into heat, dust into flavour, strangers into brothers. And in every steaming bowl they proved the frontier could still surprise you with abundance. If chili and cornbread brought the fire, then cheese and crackers brought the pause. Not every saloon meal had to roar with bravado or smoulder with spice. Sometimes the West offered something simpler, a plate you could order fast, chew absent-mindedly, and wash down with whiskey while the cards fell. Cheese wheels and crackers might not sound like frontier legends, but in a world of beans and grease, they were as close as many cowboys came to fine dining. Cheese travelled well enough to make it across the plains. Hard cheeses, salted and aged, could endure long wagon rides without turning into a science experiment. Wheels wrapped in wax or cloth arrived in saloons with the same reverence reserved for whiskey barrels. Crackers, meanwhile, were the cousins of hardtack. Less rock-like, more edible, but still sturdy enough to survive months in storage. Put the two together, and you had a snack that was quick, cheap, and oddly civilized. The ritual began with the knife. A barkeep would haul a wheel onto the counter, wipe the dust from its rind, and sink a blade into its golden heart. Thick wedges crumbled free, their edges jagged, their smell sharp and tangy. These hunks landed on small plates, paired with a stack of crackers that snapped dry between teeth. No gravy, no grease, no fire, just salt, crunch, and the tang of dairy carried westward by rail. In a room full of smoke and swagger, it almost felt genteel. Cowboys loved it for its speed. You didn't have to wait hours for beans or risk your stomach on organ stew. You tossed a coin down, grabbed your plate, and went right back to your game. Cheese and crackers kept you steady, filled just enough of the void to keep whiskey from knocking you sideways. It wasn't feast food, it was fuel food. And sometimes, fuel was all a cowboy wanted. But even this humble snack carried its quirks. Cheeses varied wildly. A well-aged cheddar might crumble sharp and nutty on your tongue. A fresher wheel might taste mild, even squeaky. Once in a while, a saloon ended up with something too far gone. A wheel that smelled so strong it cleared the table before anyone dared cut it. Cowboys laughed, called it saddle soap, and dared the bravest among them to take a bite. Someone always did. Bravado wasn't reserved just for prairie oysters, it extended to mouldy cheese as well. Crackers too had their personalities. Some came thin and crisp, baked with just enough salt to sting your lips. Others were thick, bland slabs that needed cheese piled high just to be tolerable. A bad cracker was like chewing parchment. A good one snapped clean, echoing sharp across the saloon, the sound almost as satisfying as the taste. Cowboys sometimes joked that the cracker's real purpose was to keep your hands busy between swigs of whiskey, a built-in pause button for drunkenness. Together, the pair created a strange kind of elegance. Picture a table of gamblers, cards in one hand, cheese wedge in the other, balancing crackers on their knees as they plotted their next move. The combination steadied hands, gave mouths something to do besides curse, and offered a little anchor in the swirl of smoke and noise. For a moment, in the dim glow of lanterns, they looked almost like gentlemen at a club, though their boots dripped mud, and their revolvers still glinted at their hips. Travellers from the east often remarked on the sight. They expected beans, bacon, maybe buffalo, but cheese and crackers. That felt civilized, familiar, even comforting. For those far from home, it was a taste of what they'd left behind. For locals, it was just another tool for surviving a night of whiskey. Both found reason to smile when the wheel was cut and the crackers stacked. There were games, too. Cowboys stacked crackers into towers, bet on who could balance the tallest pile before it toppled. Others carved faces into cheese wedges, propping them up like crude puppets to mock unlucky gamblers. Food in the West wasn't just for eating. It was for filling time, for breaking boredom, for turning hunger into laughter. Cheese and crackers lent themselves to all three, and yet, for all the jokes, the snack still carried dignity. Cheese had history. Monks had perfected it. Merchants had traded it. Families had passed recipes down for generations. Crackers were humble but reliable, a reminder that simplicity could still satisfy. Put them together in a saloon, and they became more than a snack. They became proof that even out here in the dust and danger, there was room for small touches of civilization. Imagine yourself at the bar. You're weary from the trail, your throat raw from dust. The bartender sets down a plate, a wedge of cheese, sharp and crumbly, and a neat stack of crackers. You bite, chew, and feel the salt and tang wake your mouth. No grease coats your lips, no spice sets your tongue ablaze. Just clean, simple flavours, the kind that remind you of quieter places. For a moment the saloon noise fades, and you remember you're human, not just a shadow moving through the wilderness. Cheese and crackers might never have inspired legends or songs, but they carved out their place quietly. They weren't survival food like beans, nor celebration food like buffalo roast. They were in-between food, the snack that steadied a gambler, sobered a drunk, and gave a cowboy just enough strength to make it home. In the endless menu of the frontier, they were the pause between extremes. So while flapjacks offered endurance, stews tested grit, beans filled, oysters proved bravado, coffee jolted, eggs fueled, rabbit soothed, pie comforted, jerky endured, and chili blazed, cheese and crackers gave something else: balance. They were the calm in the storm, the crunch between gulps, the reminder that even in the Wild West you could still sit down to something simple, steady, and strangely refined. By the time the lamps burned low and the piano's last notes dissolved into smoke, the saloon kitchen wound itself towards silence. Pots scraped bare, skillets cooled on blackened stoves, and the heavy air thinned into that strange stillness only found at the tail end of a long frontier night. This was the hour when the bravado of chili faded, the grit of beans softened, and the memory of flapjacks, stews, oysters, coffee, eggs, rabbit pie, jerky, cheese, and holiday feasts all blurred together into something quieter. The simple fact that food had bound strangers into a kind of family, however temporary. Closing the kitchen lamp was more than snuffing out a flame. It was saying goodnight to the hunger, the noise, and the day's dust. A saloon kitchen never truly slept, of course. Somewhere in the ashes of the stove coals still glowed, waiting to be stirred back to life come dawn. But for a few precious hours, the clang of ladles ceased, and even the smell of grease retreated into the rafters. Cowboys lingered at tables, hands resting on empty bowls, bellies heavy with beans or biscuits. Gamblers leaned back in chairs, sighing as the last sip of coffee cooled in their cups. Drifters who had eaten nothing more than a pickled egg tucked hats over their eyes and let exhaustion pull them under. Food had done its work, it had steadied, soothed, and, in its unglamorous way, carried them through another day. The closing hour carried rituals. The barkeep might walk the room, wiping crumbs from counters, snuffing lamps one by one. The cook scraped what little remained of stew into the dirt yard, where stray dogs and half-wild cats gathered like shadows. The egg jar was sealed, the molasses barrel hammered shut, the cheese wheel covered. Even the jerky, stubborn strips left on the counter all day sauce, was wrapped in cloth, tucked away as if guarding treasure. These small gestures reminded everyone that tomorrow would come, and with it the same routines: beans simmering, flapjacks sizzling, chili bubbling. The cycle of hunger and comfort would begin again, as predictable as sunrise. And yet, in that hush, there was always a feeling of gratitude. Cowboys who'd spent weeks on hardtack knew the miracle of a hot biscuit. Men who had eaten through fear on the trail felt steadier with gravy on their plates. Even the poorest drifter, with nothing but vinegar eggs and black coffee, carried away the memory of having been fed. In the West, that was no small gift. To sit in warmth, share food, and hear laughter echo off saloon walls was to remember that survival could be communal, not just solitary. It's easy to imagine the silence now. The shuffle of boots as the last few men leave, the creak of the swinging doors sighing shut, the barkeep blowing out the final lamp above the stove, leaving only the faint glow of embers. In that moment the saloon feels different, less like a place of wages and whiskey, more like a hearth. The food that had sustained cowboys through grit, danger, and dust lingers not in pots but in memory. The flavours settle into the room, as if the walls themselves have soaked up beans, grease, spice, and sweetness, ready to exhale them again tomorrow. And so, the Wild West saloon was never just about whiskey shots slammed on the counter or cards dealt under lamplight. It was about flapjacks that stuck like stones in your belly, stews that tested your nerve, beans that filled you through endless miles, oysters that dared your courage, coffee that shocked you awake, eggs that steadied your hunger, rabbit that soothed, biscuits and molasses that reminded you of home, buffalo roasts that marked triumph, apple pies that carried nostalgia, jerky that endured, chili that fired your veins, cheese and crackers that calmed, oysters on ice that astonished, and holiday feasts that stitched together the loneliness into community. Each dish had its own story, but together they created a chorus, the sound of survival, humour, and human need echoing through the dusty heart of the frontier. Now picture yourself at that final table. The room is quiet, the lamp glow soft. Your plate is empty, but the memory of flavour lingers. Sweet molasses on your tongue, smoky beans in your belly, coffee still buzzing faintly in your chest. You lean back, exhale, and listen to the silence press close. Outside, coyotes howl at the edge of town. Inside, only the ashes stir. You close your eyes, and for the first time all night, you feel something rare in the west. Peace. And that is the gift of the saloon kitchen, long after the last dish is cleared. Food was never just sustenance. It was ritual, challenge, comfort, and community. It gave men strength to ride, courage to fight, sweetness to remember, and warmth to carry into the dark. The kitchen lamp is out, but the memory glows on, steady, enduring, and strangely tender in the heart of a world that gave little freely. Now, let your shoulders sink, let your breath slow, and let the quiet of that closed kitchen wrap around you. Imagine the smell of bread fading into the night, the last wisp of coffee, steam dissolving into air, the hush of silence replacing clatter. The saloon is empty, but the warmth lingers, the warmth of meals shared, of hunger eased, of lives briefly joined. Drift with that memory. Let it soften the dust, ease the noise, and guide you gently into rest. The west is quiet now, and so are you. Sleep comes like a lantern dimming, steady and kind. Tomorrow the stoves will blaze again, but for tonight all is calm.